On March 2, 2026, at 12:55 p.m. Japan Standard Time, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake hit the Volcano Islands region about 1,400 kilometers south of Tokyo, roughly 20 kilometers deep, and nothing happened on the surface. No tsunami warning, no damage reports, not even a single felt report. The Japan Meteorological Agency logged it and cleared it. The automated feeds carried it for about an hour, and by evening it had slipped off every seismic tracker on the internet. Filed as offshore seismicity, no advisory issued. It should not have ended there. But when the European Mediterranean Seismological Center published its own analysis minutes later, the depth came back at roughly 11 kilometers, nearly half of what the USGS had posted. Geophon in Potsdam landed near 10 but shifted the epicenter several kilometers east of where Washington had placed it. 4 calculations from 3 agencies, and not one of them agreed on where this earthquake actually sat inside the crust. That does not happen because the quake was small. It happens because the ocean swallowed the signal before enough stations could pin it down. And when instruments lose resolution on a magnitude 6 sitting inside a 2,800-kilometer subduction boundary south of Japan, the word routine stops meaning what officials need it to mean. But here is the detail that tells the real story. I pulled the EMSC moment tensor record for March 2nd. One line in a European database, no photograph, no headline. I'm just a string of fields in plain text. Magnitude 6.0, a location south of the Bonin Islands, and a depth of 11 kilometers. 11 kilometers. That is the number that matters, because the USGS had this quake nearly twice as deep and then quietly revised it down, while Geophon matched the shallower range, but moved the epicenter kilometers away from where the Americans had placed it. 3 agencies watching the same rupture, and all 3 drew a different map of where it happened. None of this reached a single newsroom, but the depth of an earthquake is not a filing detail. It controls how energy moves through the crust, how much stress bleeds into neighboring fault segments, and whether the rupture stays buried or punches toward the surface. A 10-kilometer disagreement is the difference between pressure bleeding off quietly and pressure loading the next segment of a fault that has not slipped in decades. That one record, magnitude 6.0, or 11 kilometers deep, is the most honest account of what the Pacific crust did that Monday afternoon, and nobody outside 3 monitoring agencies looked at it twice. To understand how the Izu-Bonin-Mariana arc arrived here, watch the timeline accelerate. Minutes after the main shock, the USGS tags a magnitude 6.0 and pushes it to public feeds with a depth of 20 kilometers. Almost immediately, Geophon in Potsdam runs its own inversion and the depth drops by half, with the epicenter shifted east. Watch within the same window, EMSC in Europe locks at 11 kilometers, landing between the other 2 but matching neither. And about 12 minutes later, an aftershock fires nearby at a similar depth, confirming the fault segment is still moving and still adjusting. Hours later, a second USGS solution surfaces quietly with a bumped magnitude, a revised depth, and the epicenter relocated more than 15 kilometers from where the agency itself had originally placed it. Then the trail goes cold. No follow-up from JMA, no tsunami advisory, no bulletin from any national agency addressing why the depth kept bouncing or what the aftershock means for the segments next door. By the next morning, the event is off the latest earthquakes page, social media never touches it, and the feeds roll forward as if the crust had said all it had to say. But the fault did not go quiet. The March 2nd quake sat inside a subduction corridor that stretches 2,800 kilometers from south of Tokyo to the Mariana Trench, and corridors like that do not send a magnitude 6 as a goodbye. But that was only the beginning. The Izu-Bonin-Mariana arc is not a fault line. It is a trench, a 2,800-kilometer gash in the Pacific seafloor, where one tectonic plate is being forced beneath another. It starts south of Tokyo, runs past the Bonin Islands, cuts through the Volcano Islands where the March 2nd quake hit, and keeps going all the way down to the Mariana Trench near Guam, where the Challenger Deep drops nearly 11,000 meters below sea level at the southern end of the system. That is not a coincidence. That is the floor of the machine. Watch how this subduction system works. The Pacific Plate pushes westward at roughly 80 millimeters per year, meets the Philippine Sea Plate, and because it is older and denser, it bends downward. The descending slab does not glide. It drags against the overriding plate, building friction along the contact zone like a rubber band stretched between two fists. Pressure loads in segments, one locking while the next one creeps, and when a lock patch finally breaks, it snaps, releasing energy stored over years or decades or centuries in a matter of seconds. The deeper the slab sinks, the deeper the quakes go. And along this arc, seismometers have picked up ruptures more than 600 kilometers below the surface, deeper than almost any other subduction zone on the planet. That means the plate is intact down there, not broken, not detached, still connected to the shallow segments above it and still transmitting stress through a continuous sheet of rock from the trench floor to the deep mantle. But here is what the data actually showed. And the March 2nd event ruptured somewhere between 10 and 20 kilometers deep, the shallowest band in this system, the zone where the two plates are pressed directly against each other. Magnitude 6.0, sitting inside the arc's northern segment, the same stretch of subducting crust that feeds into the seismic zones off Japan's Pacific coast. An aftershock followed minutes later at a similar depth, and the deep earthquake catalog beneath this arc confirms the slab is mechanically continuous, loaded from trench to mantle with no gap in the stress chain. Here is the problem not making headlines. The Volcano Islands sit in one of the most instrument-poor stretches of the Western Pacific, with the nearest land-based seismic stations hundreds of kilometers away across open ocean. Waveforms lose detail crossing that much water, and arrival time picks get noisy, in which is exactly why three independent agencies each produced a different depth for the same magnitude 6. The station geometry could not pin it tighter than a 10-kilometer window. The network did not fail. It performed exactly as well as its coverage allows. And that level of performance for a subduction zone capable of generating magnitude 8+ earthquakes leaves a blind spot wide enough to hide the next catastrophe inside. When the instruments cannot agree on where a magnitude 6 ruptured and no agency publishes a correction, the system is telling you the resolution limit out loud, and nobody in the room is writing it down. And then it got worse. In the EMS-C database, the moment tensor entry for March 2nd still sits in that table. Magnitude 6.0, 11 kilometers deep, and the line kept recording. As of this recording, not one agency has published a revised depth solution for the March 2nd event, no follow-up from the USGS, no statement from GeoFon or EMS in ASI addressing the 10-kilometer spread in their calculations. The Japan Meteorological Agency lists the event and moves on. Official posture, logged, cleared, no advisory issued, no further review scheduled. Case closed, filed as offshore seismicity, no follow-up released. Except nothing about this fits that filing. Japan's own government, the Cabinet Office, not an outside research group, has published scenario projections for a major Nankai Trough earthquake along the same convergent plate boundary, with estimated casualties in the hundreds of thousands and economic damage in the trillions. The probability figure attached to a magnitude 8 to 9 rupture on that segment sits between 70 and 80% within the next 30 years, not fringe estimates from a conference poster, but the Japanese government's own planning numbers used to allocate disaster preparedness budgets right now. The question is not if, the question is when. How do you tell the families still displaced from Fukushima, 15 years after 3 reactor cores melted down, after 150,000 people were told to leave and many never came back, that the same tectonic engine fired a magnitude 6 pulse last Monday and the global monitoring network could not agree on where it sat in the crust? How do you explain that the Volcano Islands stretch, a segment of a 2,800-kilometer subduction boundary capable of generating the most powerful earthquakes on Earth, is covered by a station network so sparse that the depth estimate can swing 10 kilometers between agencies. And if this is what the data looks like for a magnitude 6 with 0 casualties in empty ocean, what does it look like when the next rupture is shallower, closer to the coast, and breaks across hundreds of kilometers of locked fault instead of one? The EMSC moment tensor entry for March 2nd is still in that database. Magnitude 6.0, 11 kilometers deep, one row that recorded what the Pacific Plate did that Monday afternoon while nobody on land felt a thing. The entry does not speculate, does not reassure, and does not care whether anyone reads it. The tensor kept recording. The 125 million people living above that plate boundary were never built to do the same.